Picture this. It's 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Millbrook, Georgia. Marcus Thorne is rushing up the steps of a courthouse that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 1970s. His perfectly pressed navy suit and leather briefcase make him stand out among the people shuffling in and out with crumpled papers and worried faces. Now, Marcus isn't your average guy. He's a federal prosecutor in Atlanta. The kind of man who puts human traffickers and corrupt politicians behind bars. He's used to commanding respect in courtrooms across the state. But today he's just a son dealing with paperwork about his father's old house. You see, Marcus lost his dad 6 months ago. Cancer took him fast, and along with the grief came all the tedious stuff nobody prepares you for. One of those things was a notice from Millbrook saying they'd raise the property taxes on his father's modest 2-bedroom home by 40%. 40%. For a house in a neighborhood where the biggest excitement is Mrs. Johnson's prize-winning tomatoes. Marcus knew it was a mistake. Had to be. He'd spent weeks gathering documents, pulling old tax records, even getting a new property assessment. The evidence was crystal clear. Someone in the city office had made an error, and today was supposed to be the day he'd walk in, show his paperwork, and walk out with it fixed. Simple, right? As Marcus checked his watch, 8:48 a.m., he muttered to himself, "Dad always said punctuality shows respect." His father, Robert Thorne, had been a high school principal who believed in doing things the right way. Show up on time, dress appropriately, and speak the truth, he used to say. Marcus lived by those words. The delay wasn't his fault, though. That morning, his phone had exploded with an emergency, a major human trafficking case he'd been working on for months. The defense had filed some last-minute motion trying to get key evidence thrown out. Marcus couldn't ignore it. Lives were literally on the line. So he'd spent 30 minutes on a conference call with his team, making sure they had everything covered. Now he was cutting it close, but he wasn't worried. This was just a municipal court hearing about property taxes. How complicated could it be? The courthouse lobby smelled like old coffee and stress. People clutched manila folders and spoke in hushed, nervous voices. Traffic tickets, small disputes, parking violations. This was where everyday people came to deal with life's minor legal headaches. It felt worlds away from the federal courtrooms where Marcus usually worked. He found room 204 and slipped inside. The courtroom was already half full, and at the front sat Judge Harrison Sterling, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested he didn't suffer fools gladly. Marcus found a seat in the back and opened his folder. Everything was organized perfectly. The original tax assessment, the new inflated one, photographs of the property, comparable sales in the neighborhood. Open and shut case. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Sterling called the court to order. Marcus watched as he handled the first few cases with mechanical efficiency. A parking ticket here, a noise complaint there. Nothing dramatic. Then Marcus noticed something interesting. Around 9:05, a young white woman in jeans and a t-shirt quietly slipped into the courtroom. She'd clearly been running. Her hair was messy, and she looked flustered. Judge Sterling didn't even glance her way. At 9:08, a middle-aged white man in a rumpled suit hurried in and took a seat near the front. Again, nothing from the judge. Marcus made a mental note, but didn't think much of it. Judges had different styles, right? At 9:15 a.m., he heard his name called. Marcus Thorne versus City of Millbrook, property tax dispute. Marcus gathered his folder and walked confidently to the front of the courtroom. This was routine for him. He'd presented arguments to federal judges, Supreme Court justices, panels of appeals court judges. A simple property tax issue should be a walk in the park. But as he approached the podium, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. Judge Sterling looked up from his papers, and his expression hardened. Not the neutral, professional look Marcus was used to from judges. This was something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "You're late, Mr. Thorne," the judge said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet courtroom like a blade. Marcus blinked, confused. "Your Honor, I apologize, but I believe I'm actually 15 minutes late," Judge Sterling interrupted. "Do you think this court's time is less valuable than your own?" The words hit Marcus like a slap. Around him, he could feel the other people in the courtroom tensing up. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how judges typically addressed attorneys, especially over a few minutes. Marcus kept his voice calm and respectful. "Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for any delay. I was handling an urgent federal matter this morning." "Excuses?" The judge cut him off again. "This court operates on discipline and respect. If you can't follow basic rules, perhaps you should reconsider your priorities." Marcus felt every eye in the room on him. The young woman who'd arrived actually late was staring with wide eyes. The man in the rumpled suit looked uncomfortable. Even the court clerk had stopped typing and was watching the exchange with obvious unease. This wasn't about being late. Marcus had been in enough courtrooms to recognize the difference between a judge enforcing rules and a judge making a point. This felt personal. This felt wrong. "Your Honor," Marcus said carefully, "I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may present my case regarding the property tax adjustment." Judge Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "We'll address that in due time. First, there's the matter of your contempt for this court's procedures." The word contempt hung in the air like smoke from a gun. "You are hereby fined $850 for your tardiness and disrespect." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained professional. Around him, he could hear people shifting in their seats, uncomfortable murmurs rippling through the room. $850 for being a few minutes late to a property tax hearing. Marcus had prosecuted enough cases to know when something stank, and this situation reeked. The fine was excessive, punitive, and completely disproportionate. But more than that, it was the disparity. Those other people who'd arrived late, the ones with lighter skin, they'd been invisible to Judge Sterling. But Marcus got the full force of his authority. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "May I respectfully ask if this fine is standard for tardiness in your courtroom?" Judge Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning this court's procedures, Mr. Thorne?" "I'm asking for clarity on how rules are applied." The tension in the room could be cut with a knife. The court clerk's fingers had frozen over her keyboard. The bailiff was watching intently from his post by the wall. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his federal prosecutor's badge and identification. He held them up so everyone in the room could see them clearly. "Your Honor, I should have introduced myself properly from the beginning. I'm Marcus Thorne, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. I've been with the Department of Justice for 12 years, specializing in civil rights violations, corruption cases, and human trafficking." The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Sterling's face went from flushed to pale in the span of a heartbeat. The court clerk actually gasped. Throughout the courtroom, people sat up straighter, suddenly understanding they were witnessing something significant. Marcus continued, his voice carrying a quiet authority that filled every corner of the room. "The urgent matter that delayed me this morning was a federal human trafficking case involving 17 victims. I had to ensure their safety and rights were protected before I could attend to personal matters." Judge Sterling looked like a man who'd suddenly realized he was standing in quicksand. "Now," Marcus said, placing his credentials on the podium where everyone could see them, "I'd like to return to the question of how rules are applied in this courtroom. As a federal prosecutor who has dedicated his career to ensuring equal justice under law, I have to say I'm concerned about what I've observed here today. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Marcus glanced back at the woman who'd arrived late, then at the man in the rumpled suit. Both were staring at him with expressions of awe and disbelief. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of his courtroom. "Mr. Thorne, your professional responsibilities are noted. However, the fine stands." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. "I understand, Your Honor. I'll be sure to document today's proceedings thoroughly." He paused, letting that sink in. "As is my duty as an officer of the court." As Marcus returned to his seat, his mind was already racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about a property tax dispute or even an unfair fine. This was about a pattern, a system, a problem that had probably been going on for years, affecting people who didn't have federal prosecutor badges to protect them. Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing notes. Names, times, observations. The young woman who'd been ignored. The man who'd been overlooked. The way Judge Sterling's entire demeanor had changed the moment Marcus revealed who he was. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Sometimes, son, doing the right thing means standing up even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." As the morning session continued, Marcus sat in the back row and watched. Really watched. And what he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. This was just the beginning. You know that feeling when you pull on a loose thread and the whole sweater starts unraveling? That's exactly what happened to Marcus Thorne over the next 2 weeks. What started as documenting one unfair fine turned into something that would keep Marcus awake at night, staring at his ceiling, wondering how deep this rabbit hole really went. The first call came just 3 days after the courthouse incident. Marcus was in his Atlanta office, reviewing case files, when his secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Thorne, there's a woman on line 2 who says she was in Judge Sterling's courtroom when you had your confrontation. She says she needs to talk to you." The woman's name was Sarah Chun, a 28-year-old teacher who'd been fighting a parking ticket. Her voice shook as she told Marcus her story. "I was there that morning," she said. "I saw how he treated you, and it made me realize I wasn't crazy. Last year, I got a $400 fine for that parking ticket. $400. My neighbor, she's white, got the exact same ticket and paid $75. When I asked about the difference, the clerk just said different circumstances." Marcus grabbed a legal pad and started writing. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail." What Sarah told him made Marcus's blood run cold. She'd arrived in Judge Sterling's courtroom nervous, but prepared. She had photos showing the parking meter was broken, timestamps proving she'd only been parked for 10 minutes, even a witness statement from a shop owner. Open and shut case, right? But Judge Sterling barely looked at her evidence. He interrupted her twice, questioned whether she really understood parking regulations, and imposed a fine that was 5 times the normal amount. When Sarah asked about a payment plan, she was a teacher. Money was tight. He denied it curtly. "The woman right before me," Sarah continued. "She had the same violation, no evidence at all, and she got the minimum fine plus a payment plan. I sat there thinking, what's different about us? But I knew. Deep down I knew." Marcus felt sick. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. Word spread faster than Marcus expected. By the end of the week, his voicemail was full. 23 people had called, all with similar stories from Judge Sterling's courtroom. All minorities. All hit with excessive fines, denied payment plans, or humiliated in ways that white defendants somehow avoided. But the call that changed everything came from someone Marcus never expected. "Mr. Thorne, this is Beverly, Washington. I work I used to work at the Millbrook courthouse. Beverly's voice was barely above a whisper, like she was afraid someone might be listening. I was Judge Sterling's court clerk for 8 years. I retired last month because I couldn't take it anymore. What I saw in that courtroom, what you experienced, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Marcus leaned forward. Beverly, I need to meet with you. Can you come to my office? No, she said quickly. Too public. There's a diner off Highway 92, about 20 minutes outside Millbrook. Rosie's Place. Can you meet me there tomorrow at 2 p.m.? The next afternoon, Marcus found himself in a booth at Rosie's Place, a small diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. Beverly Washington was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I brought something, she said, sliding a small notebook across the table. I know I wasn't supposed to keep records, but I couldn't help myself. Marcus opened the notebook and felt his stomach drop. Page after page of meticulous notes. Dates, names, case numbers, fine amounts. All organized by race. The pattern wasn't just obvious. It was devastating. Beverly, Marcus whispered. How long has this been going on? 8 years that I know of. Probably longer. Tears started forming in her eyes. I wanted to say something so many times, but who would believe me? And I needed that job. My husband's been sick, and the insurance. Marcus reached across the table and gently touched her hand. You did the right thing by keeping these records. You may have just saved a lot of people. Beverly's notes told a story that made Marcus's encounter look mild by comparison. Judge Sterling had a system. Black defendants got fines averaging $427 for minor infractions. White defendants with identical violations averaged $89. Hispanic defendants fell somewhere in between at $234. But it wasn't just the amounts, it was the humiliation. Beverly had documented instances where Sterling questioned black defendants' employment, their parenting, their life choices, while treating white defendants with courtesy and respect. One entry made Marcus's hands clench into fists. March 15th, elderly black woman, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, contested improper towing fee. Had all documentation proving her car was legally parked. Judge Sterling fined her $650 anyway, said she needed to take responsibility for her actions. Case right after. Young white man, same violation, no documentation. Fine. $45 with payment plan. Beverly, Marcus said carefully. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think really hard about this. Where do these fines go? Do they all go to the city? Beverly's face went white. She looked around the diner nervously before leaning in close. That's what I could never figure out. The amounts Judge Sterling was imposing, they didn't match what was getting reported to the city finance office. I tried to reconcile the books several times, but the numbers never added up. Marcus felt his prosecutor instincts kicking into high gear. What do you mean they didn't add up? The city was only receiving about 60% of what was being collected. I asked the head clerk about it once, and she told me to mind my own business. Said Judge Sterling handled the special administrative fees himself. Special administrative fees. Marcus had prosecuted enough corruption cases to know exactly what that meant. Beverly, I need you to do something for me, and I know it's scary, but I need you to make copies of these records and give them to me officially. What you've documented here. This isn't just bias. This might be embezzlement. The word hung between them like a live wire. You think he's been stealing? Beverly whispered. I think we need to find out. 3 days later, Marcus was sitting in his supervisor's office with Beverly's notebook spread across the desk. Julia Martinez, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, was a woman who'd seen everything in her 20-year career. But even she looked stunned as she flipped through the pages. Marcus, If this is accurate, we're not just looking at civil rights violations. We're potentially looking at wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. This could be federal. It gets worse, Marcus said, sliding another folder across the desk. I did some preliminary research on Judge Sterling's finances. He's been making some interesting purchases over the past few years. Julia opened the folder and whistled low. A $80,000 boat. A vacation home in Florida. A BMW. All on a municipal judge's salary? Exactly. And here's the kicker. I tracked down Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, the elderly woman from Beverly's notes. She lost her house because she couldn't pay Sterling's inflated fine. She's been living with her daughter ever since. Julia closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Marcus, I'm authorizing a full investigation, but I need you to understand something. Once we start this, there's no going back. If Sterling has been systematically stealing from defendants while discriminating against them, this is going to explode. Marcus thought about his father, about Mrs. Hayes sleeping on her daughter's couch, about all the people who'd called him with their stories of humiliation and injustice. Good, he said. It's time someone held him accountable. The investigation moved fast once it started. Federal agents obtained warrants for Sterling's financial records. They interviewed dozens of former defendants. They analyzed years of court records. And what they found was worse than Marcus had imagined. Judge Sterling hadn't just been imposing higher fines on minority defendants out of bias. He'd been systematically skimming money from those fines for himself. The special administrative fees Beverly had noticed were going directly into Sterling's personal accounts. Over 5 years, he'd stolen nearly $400,000. $400,000 taken from people who could least afford it, people who trusted the system to treat them fairly. But Sterling wasn't going down without a fight. The threatening messages started arriving at Marcus's office within days of the investigation going public. Unsigned letters, anonymous phone calls, even a brick through his car window with a note tied to it. Drop this or else. Marcus brought the threats to the FBI, but he wasn't backing down. If anything, they convinced him he was on the right track. The local media picked up the story, and it exploded across Georgia. Federal prosecutor exposes corrupt judge. Systemic bias and embezzlement in Millbrook Court. The $400,000 scandal. Judge Sterling tried damage control, holding a press conference where he denied any wrongdoing and suggested Marcus was pursuing a personal vendetta. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. Then came the moment Marcus had been waiting for. A federal grand jury returned a 23-count indictment against Judge Harrison Sterling. Embezzlement, wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The charges carried a potential sentence of 30 years in federal prison. As Marcus read the indictment in his office that evening, his phone rang. It was Beverly, Washington. Mr. Thorne, I just wanted to thank you. I've been carrying this guilt for 8 years, watching him hurt people and not being able to stop it. I know this was scary for you too, taking on a sitting judge, but you did the right thing. Marcus smiled, thinking about his father's words about standing up even when it's uncomfortable. Beverly, we all did the right thing. Finally! But Marcus had no idea that the most dramatic moment was still to come. Because Judge Sterling was about to make a decision that would shock everyone, including Marcus. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a whisper in the wind. But sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes with handcuffs and federal agents, right in the middle of a Tuesday morning court session. This was going to be one of those times. Marcus stood outside the same courthouse where this whole journey had begun 3 months earlier. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't here as a frustrated son dealing with property taxes. Today, he was here as the lead federal prosecutor on a case that had captured national attention. The media trucks lined the street. Reporters with their perfectly styled hair and serious expressions spoke into cameras about corruption in small-town America and a federal prosecutor's fight for justice. But Marcus barely noticed them. His focus was entirely on what was about to happen inside that courthouse. At exactly 9 a.m., Marcus walked through the same doors he'd entered months ago, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him were FBI agent Sarah Rodriguez and Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park. In Marcus's briefcase wasn't evidence about property taxes. It was a federal arrest warrant. Judge Harrison Sterling had no idea what was coming. The courtroom looked exactly the same. Same scuffed chairs, same beige walls, same smell of old coffee and stress. But the energy was completely different. Word had gotten out that something big was happening, and the gallery was packed with reporters, former defendants, and curious locals. Beverly Washington sat in the third row, clutching her purse with white knuckles. Sarah Chun, the teacher who'd made that first brave phone call, was there too. So was Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, the elderly woman who'd lost her house because of Sterling's inflated fine. She'd insisted on coming, even though her daughter worried it would be too stressful. "I need to see this," Mrs. Hayes had told Marcus the day before. "I need to see justice done." At 9:15 a.m., Judge Sterling entered his courtroom for what would be the last time. He looked older than Marcus remembered, more tired. The stress of the past few months had clearly taken its toll. But he still carried himself with that same arrogant authority, still believing he was untouchable. Sterling settled into his chair and began calling cases with his usual mechanical efficiency. Traffic violations, small disputes, parking tickets, the mundane business of municipal court that had provided cover for his crimes for so many years. Marcus waited. The arrest warrant in his briefcase seemed to burn with anticipation. At 9:42 a.m., almost exactly the same time Marcus had been called up months earlier, Sterling looked up from his papers. "Next case," he announced, not bothering to look at the gallery packed with unusual faces. That's when Marcus stood up. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Before you proceed, there's a federal matter that requires immediate attention." Sterling's head snapped up, and his face went white when he saw Marcus standing there. Their eyes locked across the courtroom, and in that moment, Sterling knew. You could see it in his expression. The sudden understanding that his world was about to collapse. "Mr. Thorne," Sterling said, his voice slightly shaky but still trying to maintain authority. "This is highly irregular. You have no standing in this court." Marcus walked calmly to the front of the courtroom, Agent Rodriguez and Attorney Park flanking him. "Actually, Your Honor, I have federal standing." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Marcus pulled the warrant from his briefcase and held it up. "Judge Harrison Sterling, I have here a federal arrest warrant issued by the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia." The words seemed to echo in the stunned silence. "The warrant charges you with 23 federal counts, including embezzlement of public funds, wire fraud, conspiracy, and deprivation of rights under color of law." Sterling's gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice professional but firm. "Judge Sterling, please stand and step down from the bench." For a moment, Sterling didn't move. He sat frozen, staring at the warrant in Marcus's hand like it was a snake about to strike. The man who had wielded absolute power in this room for over a decade suddenly looked very small. This is outrageous," Sterling stammered, finally finding his voice. "I am a sitting judge. You cannot." "The warrant is valid and enforceable," Marcus interrupted. "Please cooperate with Agent Rodriguez." The next few moments felt like they were happening in slow motion. Sterling slowly rose from his chair, his legs unsteady. He looked out at the packed gallery, at the faces of people he had humiliated and cheated for years, and seemed to deflate completely. Agent Rodriguez approached the bench. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As she read Sterling his Miranda rights, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. Some people were filming with their phones. Others sat with their mouths open in disbelief. Mrs. Hayes was crying, not from sadness, but from relief. The handcuffs clicked into place. Judge Harrison Sterling, the man who had terrorized defendants in this courtroom for over a decade, who had stolen nearly $400,000 from the people he was supposed to serve, was led out of his own courtroom in handcuffs. As they reached the door, Sterling turned back one last time. His eyes found Marcus in the crowd. "You have no idea what you've done," Sterling said, his voice bitter and broken. Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "I know exactly what I've done, Your Honor. I've made sure you'll never hurt anyone else." The courtroom erupted as soon as Sterling disappeared through the door. People were crying, cheering, talking all at once. Reporters were rushing to file their stories. The bailiff looked completely lost. He'd never dealt with anything like this in 30 years on the job. Marcus felt a gentle touch on his arm and turned to see Mrs. Hayes standing beside him. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for caring about people like me." Marcus had to swallow hard to keep his own emotions in check. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to tell you something. The court has ordered that all of Judge Sterling's assets be seized to compensate his victims. That includes your house." Her eyes widened. "My house? The foreclosure is being reversed. You're getting your home back." Mrs. Hayes collapsed into Marcus's arms, sobbing with joy. But the story didn't end there. The Sterling case became a catalyst for reform across the entire state of Georgia. Within 6 months, the state legislature passed the Judicial Accountability Act, requiring mandatory bias training for all judges, regular audits of court finances, and independent oversight of municipal courts. Sterling himself was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims. The $400,000 he'd stolen was returned to the people he'd cheated, with interest. Beverly Washington was hired as a consultant to help design new financial oversight systems for courts across the South. Sarah Chun started law school, inspired by what she'd witnessed. She sent Marcus a card on her first day. "Thank you for showing me that one person really can make a difference." A year later, Marcus received an invitation that made him smile. The Millbrook Courthouse was being renamed. A small ceremony was planned, and they wanted him to be the guest speaker. Standing in front of that same building where it all began, Marcus looked out at the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. There were local officials, community leaders, former defendants, and many of the people who'd been brave enough to speak up when it mattered. Above the entrance, a new sign read, "The Marcus Thorne Center for Equal Justice." Marcus shook his head, still hardly believing it. "You know," he told the crowd, "when my father taught me to stand up for what's right, I don't think he imagined it would lead to this. But he did tell me something that I've never forgotten. Son, sometimes doing the right thing is uncomfortable, but that's exactly when it matters most." He paused, looking up at the sign bearing his name. This building represents something important. It represents the idea that justice isn't just about laws and procedures. It's about treating every person who walks through these doors with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The crowd erupted in applause. "But most importantly," Marcus continued, "this represents all of you. Beverly Washington, who kept meticulous records for 8 years because she knew something was wrong. Sarah Chun, who made that first brave phone call. Mrs. Hayes, who never gave up fighting for what was right. Every person who spoke up, who shared their story, who refused to accept that injustice was just how things are." More applause. "The real lesson here isn't about me," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough. When they decide that silence isn't an option anymore. When they decide to fight for something better. As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Marcus stood alone for a moment, looking up at the courthouse. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant back in Atlanta. 3 more courtrooms in Alabama have requested bias audits after hearing about the Sterling case. Looks like you started something. Marcus smiled and typed back. Good. It's about time. A young black law student approached him as he was walking to his car. Mr. Thorne? I just wanted to thank you. I'm starting law school next month, and what you did, it made me believe that the legal system really can work for everyone. Marcus shook the young man's hand. What's your name? James. James Wilson. Well, James Wilson, let me tell you something my father told me. The law isn't perfect, and the people who practice it aren't perfect either. But if we all commit to doing better, to standing up when we see something wrong, to fighting for justice even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, then we can make this system work for everyone. James nodded eagerly. I won't let you down, sir. You won't let yourself down, Marcus corrected gently. That's what matters. As Marcus drove back toward Atlanta that evening, he thought about how much had changed since that morning months ago when he'd walked into Sterling's courtroom just trying to fix a property tax issue. He thought about his father, and how proud he'd be to know that those lessons about standing up for what's right had led to real change in the world. And he thought about all the people who would walk into that courthouse in the future, the Marcus Thorne Center for Equal Justice, and receive the fair treatment they deserved, not because of who they were or what they looked like, but because they were human beings entitled to dignity and respect. Sometimes, Marcus realized, the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight. Sometimes justice comes to you, demanding that you choose between comfort and conscience. And sometimes, when you choose conscience, you change the world. This is why one person's courage matters. Marcus Thorne walked into a courthouse as a grieving son and walked out as a champion of justice. His story reminds us that when we see something wrong, we have a choice: stay silent or speak up. The real Judge Sterlings of the world count on our silence. They count on us thinking we can't make a difference. But as Marcus proved, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to say enough to change everything. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.